In a quiet town, an untold secret waits to be revealed. One night, as everyone else falls into a deep sleep, 10-year-old Emily senses something is wrong. Anastasia, her Labrador dog, suddenly changes. There's only one way to uncover what's truly happening, but the price to pay is steep. Will Emily and her loyal dog survive the looming threat? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting. The story begins right now. The courtroom in Ashford, a quiet town nestled between rolling hills, was buzzing with a tension that even the thick oak walls couldn't muffle. The polished benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the room was filled with a mix of curiosity, anticipation, and whispers. This was no ordinary case for Ashford, a town where crime was usually confined to gossip about misplaced garden tools. At the center of it all was Emily Radcliffe, a petite 10-year-old with chestnut brown hair that fell into her wide, uncertain eyes. She sat nervously in the witness stand, clutching the leash of her Labrador service dog, Anastasia. The dog's golden fur shone, and his calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Emily's trembling hands. Her small fingers twisted the leash repeatedly, as if anchoring herself to the comforting presence of her canine companion. Judge Sarah Brighton, a woman whose reputation for balance and fairness had made her a figure of both respect and fear, observed Emily intently from her elevated seat. Despite her stern appearance, silver hair tied back neatly, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, there was a flicker of understanding in her gaze. She could see the weight of the moment pressing on the young girl. The case was a strange one. A burglary at the Radcliffe home had left more questions than answers. There had been no forced entry, yet valuable items were missing. The only witness to the crime was Emily, and possibly Anastasia. John Calloway, Emily's lawyer, leaned toward her, his voice low and steady. He was known for his gentle approach, particularly in cases involving children. Emily looked up at him, her lips trembling slightly, and nodded. She had been coached on what to say, but the reality of speaking in front of a packed courtroom made her feel as though her words were trapped somewhere deep inside her. As Judge Brighton called for order, the whispers faded, replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the creak of wooden chairs. Emily took a deep breath. The lawyer began questioning her gently, asking about the night of the burglary. Emily hesitated. Her eyes darted toward Anastasia, who sat upright, his calm, steady gaze fixed on her. She squeezed the leash tightly, her fingers white against the red nylon. She finally spoke, her voice barely audible. She described how Anastasia had been acting strangely that night. Normally a calm dog, Anastasia had paced near the front door, occasionally letting out low growls that Emily had never heard before. She remembered feeling uneasy, but being a child, she had dismissed it as Anastasia being restless. Judge Brighton watched closely. She noticed that whenever Emily spoke, her fingers made small, almost imperceptible movements along Anastasia's leash. It was as though she was communicating with the dog in a silent, secret language. Anastasia responded with subtle shifts, his ears twitching, his tail flicking slightly, as if encouraging her. As Emily sat nervously in the witness stand, her fingers unconsciously working the leash, memories of Anastasia's training flooded her mind. She remembered the early days when Anastasia was just a wiggly puppy with oversized paws and boundless energy. Those days were a blur of sadness and change, coming shortly after her mother's death in a car accident. Her world had crumbled, leaving a gaping hole in her small heart. But then came Anastasia, a gift from her father, who seemed to understand that no words could heal what Emily had lost. Her father, a former canine officer, had always believed in the power of dogs. He saw in Anastasia the potential for something extraordinary. Determined to give Emily a sense of security, he dedicated hours every day to training Anastasia as a therapy and emotional support dog. Anastasia wasn't just taught to fetch or sit on command. He was trained to sense fear, recognize danger, and respond with unwavering loyalty. Emily watched as her father worked tirelessly with Anastasia. She could still hear his firm but gentle voice giving commands in their backyard. Her father would set up scenarios to test Anastasia's instincts. He'd hide objects in the house and teach Anastasia to find them. rewarding him with treats and praise when he succeeded. Over time, the training became more advanced. He taught Anastasia to identify unusual sounds, react to sudden movements, and remain calm in chaotic situations. Emily had been part of the training too, though she didn't realize it at the time. Her father showed her how to use hand signals to communicate with Anastasia. Simple gestures, a tap of her fingers, a shift of her wrist, could tell Anastasia to stay close, sit, or alert him to something unusual. At first it felt strange to Emily, but as she practiced, she realized how much Anastasia understood her, even when she didn't say a word. Their bond grew deeper with every passing day. For Emily, Anastasia became more than a dog. He was her guardian, her confidant, and the one being in her life who seemed to understand her pain without needing an explanation. On nights when the sadness was too much, Anastasia would curl up beside her, his presence a comfort that words could never provide. The night of the burglary was still fresh in Emily's mind. Even as she sat in the courtroom, she had been lying in bed, struggling to sleep as usual. The house was quiet, but there was a strange tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. Anastasia, who normally slept at the foot of her bed, was restless. He paced back and forth, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Emily had tried to ignore it, pulling over her head and willing herself to sleep. But then came a low growl, a sound she had never heard from Anastasia before. She peeked out from under the blanket and saw him standing rigid by the bedroom door, his ears pricked and his body alert. Fear began to creep in, tightening her chest. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of something scraping against the window downstairs. Her heart raced as she sat up, clutching Anastasia's leash. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like muffled footsteps. Emily's hands trembled, but Anastasia remained steady, his intense focus locked on the direction of the sound. Unable to stay put, Emily crept to her bedroom door, her small frame pressed against the wood. She could feel Anastasia's warmth beside her, his body tense but reassuring. Together they listened, the house eerily silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards below. Then came a louder noise, a soft thud followed by a shuffling sound. Emily's breath hitched and she instinctively tightened her grip on Anastasia's leash. She didn't know what to do. Her father had always told her to stay safe and let Anastasia lead in moments like this. So she whispered a hand signal to Anastasia, her trembling fingers barely moving. Anastasia responded immediately, his body shifting into a protective stance. His tail lowered and his ears flattened slightly as he moved to position himself between Emily and the door. She could feel his strength, his unspoken promise to keep her safe. The shadow came next. From the crack under her door, Emily could see it, a dark shape moving across the hallway below. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought whoever it was might hear it. But Anastasia remained quiet, his growl barely audible now, as if he knew silence was their best defense. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before retreating toward the living room. Emily exhaled shakily, her legs too weak to move. She stayed pressed against the door, Anastasia standing firm beside her. When the intruder finally left, Anastasia barked sharply, a sound that echoed through the empty house. It was as if he knew the danger had passed, and he was alerting Emily to the same. She clung to him then, burying her face in his fur as tears streamed down her cheeks. She was terrified, but Anastasia's presence gave her a sense of safety she couldn't explain. As Emily recounted these moments in court, her voice quivered, but her connection to Anastasia was undeniable. She didn't have the words to fully describe what Anastasia had done for her that night, but everyone in the room could see it in her eyes. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through love, loss, and the kind of trust that could only exist between a child and her dog. As Emily's testimony ended, the quiet hum of a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut grew louder. The jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Emily, her devoted dog, and the defense table. Jack Holcroft, the accused, sat there with a faint smirk playing on his lips. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, exuding a confidence that felt out of place in such a tense environment. Holcroft was well known in Ashford, a handyman with reputation for being reliable, but occasionally brash. The accusations against him had shaken the small town, dividing its residents. Some believed he was incapable of such a crime, citing his years of service fixing everything from leaky roofs to broken fences. Others whispered about his temper and rumored gambling debts. Holcroft's defense attorney, a sharp-suited man from the city, wasted no time trying to dismantle Emily's account. He pointed out her young age, questioning her ability to identify anyone in the dark. Holcroft, for his part, sat stone-faced, only occasionally shaking his head in mock disbelief as the testimony continued. When it was his turn to speak, Holcroft's demeanor changed. He addressed a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, with a steady, measured tone, denying any involvement in the burglary. He claimed he had never been near the Radcliffe home that night and suggested the police were desperate to find someone to blame. His confidence seemed to sway some of the spectators, but others remained unconvinced. Emily, sitting quietly beside her lawyer, felt the weight of Holcroft's denial pressing down on her. She clutched Anastasia's leash tightly, her small hand trembling. Her father's training came back to her, reminding her to trust Anastasia's instincts. She glanced down at her loyal companion, who sat alert at her feet. The prosecutor began questioning Holcroft, pointing out inconsistencies in his alibi. Holcroft maintained his composure, though a faint sheen of sweat began to glisten on his brow. He insisted he had spent the night at home, working on a project for a client. When asked for specifics, his answers became vaguer, and the prosecutor pressed harder. Emily's gaze never left Holcroft. Despite her fear, she tried to recall every detail from that night. As the questioning continued, she reached down and signaled to Anastasia with a tap of her fingers. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Anastasia immediately shifted his posture, his ears perking up. The next moment happened so quickly it left a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, stunned. Anastasia stood abruptly, his body tense and his gaze fixed on Holcroft. A low growl rumbled in his throat, growing louder until it erupted into a sharp, commanding bark. The sound echoed through the room, startling everyone into silence. Holcroft froze, his smug expression vanishing in an instant. His eyes widened as he looked at the dog, whose unwavering focus was now entirely on him. The tension in the room became unbearable, a charged silence hanging over the scene. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Spectators whispered to one another, speculating about what had just occurred. Some pointed at Holcroft, whose face had grown pale, while others looked at Anastasia with newfound respect. Judge Brighton's gavel struck the bench sharply, silencing the courtroom. The tension remained thick in the air, but her firm voice commanded order. She directed her attention to Emily, her tone softened by curiosity. She wanted to understand what had just occurred. The judge asked Emily to explain Anastasia's behavior, her words measured and careful to avoid frightening the young girl. Emily glanced nervously at her father, David, who gave her an encouraging nod from his seat in the gallery. Gathering her courage, she spoke quietly but clearly. She explained that Anastasia had been trained by her father to recognize threats and act accordingly. She told the judge that Anastasia's growl and bark were not random. It was his way of signaling danger or sensing someone he believed could cause harm. The courtroom listened intently as Emily described how Anastasia only reacted like this in serious situations. She recounted a time when Anastasia had growled at a repairman who had entered their home unexpectedly, later revealing the man's intimidating body language had triggered Anastasia's protective instincts. The dog's reaction to Holcroft, Emily explained, was identical to what she had seen that night during the break-in. Without giving any space for the judge to respond, Holcroft's attorney quickly objected, dismissing Anastasia's behavior as irrelevant. He argued that a dog's actions couldn't be used as evidence and attempted to shift attention back to his client's denial. But the damage had already been done. The atmosphere in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, had shifted, and doubt about Holcroft's innocence now lingered heavily in the air. As the session continued, Anastasia remained alert at Emily's side, his eyes occasionally flicking back to Holcroft. For the first time, Holcroft seemed unsettled, his earlier confidence replaced by a visible unease. The courtroom watched him closely, searching for cracks in his facade. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Anastasia had sensed something no one else could. Whether it was the faint scent of the intruder from that night or the tension in Holcroft's body, Anastasia's reaction had been undeniable. It wasn't just a bark. It was a warning, a signal that the truth was closer than anyone had realized. Judge Bratton leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes studying Emily and Anastasia. The bond between the two was undeniable, and Anastasia's reaction to Holcroft had left a lasting impression. The judge appeared thoughtful for a moment before adjourning the court for the day, citing the need to review the case further before proceeding. As a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut began to clear, David approached Emily, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. They left the courthouse together, Anastasia trotting loyally beside them. Outside, the crisp air of Ashford seemed heavier than usual, laden with unspoken questions and lingering tension. That evening, back at their modest home, Emily sat on the couch, Anastasia resting his head on her lap. David paced the living room, his mind racing with thoughts about the case. They had both been shaken by Anastasia's reaction in court, but something about it had also stirred memories David hadn't thought about since the night of the break-in. David reminded Emily about how Anastasia had been acting strangely for days after the burglary. The dog had been scratching at the garden shed behind their home, whining and refusing to leave it alone. At the time, they had assumed Anastasia was simply anxious after the events of that night. David had dismissed it, thinking nothing of it. Emily nodded, recalling how Anastasia had stood at the shed door, his body tense and his tail wagging nervously. She remembered pulling him away, worried that he might hurt himself, but Anastasia's insistence had left an impression. Even then, Emily had felt as though Anastasia was trying to tell them something. The next day, as the session began, the prosecution presented a new angle to their case, Holcroft's past. The district attorney introduced records showing that Holcroft had been fired from his position as a handyman at Emily's school 2 years earlier. The dismissal was tied to several accusations of theft. Teachers and staff had reported missing items, including small electronics and cash. And while nothing had been definitively proven, Holcroft's access to every room made him the primary suspect. The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. The prosecution highlighted that this wasn't the first time Holcroft had been suspected of wrongdoing, though he had never faced charges due to lack of concrete evidence. Now, with his name connected to the burglary at Emily's home, his history painted a picture of a man who had long skirted the edges of the law. Judge Bratton listened attentively, her piercing gaze shifting between Holcroft and the prosecution. She made a note to consider the new information carefully, instructing the court to proceed. Meanwhile, Emily sat quietly beside her father, her hands gripping Anastasia's leash. Later, David was called to the stand. He looked composed, but his eyes carried the weight of a father's determination to protect his daughter. As he recounted his memory of the night in question, a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut leaned in, sensing the importance of his testimony. David explained how he had been returning home late from work that night. The street lights along their quiet cul-de-sac flickered faintly as he approached the house, his mind occupied with the events of the day. As he turned into the driveway, he noticed something strange, a shadowy figure near the side of the house. He admitted the details were hazy. The figure had been partially obscured by the fence, the movements quick and deliberate. David had initially thought it was just a neighbor cutting through the yard, but Anastasia's reaction made him pause. From inside the house, Anastasia's barking was sharp and unrelenting. It wasn't the excited bark of greeting or play. It was deep, aggressive, and filled with warning. David parked his car hastily, stepping out to get a better look. But by the time he reached the backyard, the figure had disappeared into the night, followed by sounds of a truck engine at a distance. The only evidence left behind was a disturbed patch of grass near the fence, and Anastasia's continued growling, his body pressed against the door. David had brushed it off at the time, thinking it might have been an animal or a harmless passerby, but his daughter's report made him call the police. As David spoke, Emily's mind wandered back to that night. She remembered waking up to Anastasia's barking and the sense of unease that had settled over her, even before she heard the noises outside. She had always trusted Anastasia's instincts, and hearing her father recount his experience only reinforced her belief that her dog had been trying to protect her from something or someone dangerous. Holcroft shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer scribbling notes furiously. The atmosphere in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, grew heavier as David described Anastasia's behavior near the fence. The dog's growling had been persistent, almost desperate, as though he could sense the danger even after the figure had fled. The prosecution seized on this point, arguing that Anastasia's reactions were not random, but part of his training to detect threats. Combined with Holcroft's past and the items found in the shed, the evidence painted a damning picture. Still, Holcroft's lawyer attempted to discredit David's testimony, pointing out the lack of a clear description of the figure and the absence of any direct link between Holcroft and the shed. The defense emphasized that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, was not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite the objections, the courtroom's perception of Holcroft was shifting. His history, the figure near the fence, and Anastasia's unyielding instincts were weaving a narrative that was hard to ignore. Emily watched him carefully, her small hands stroking Anastasia's fur for comfort. She couldn't explain why, but something about Holcroft's presence felt wrong, as though Anastasia's growls in court had confirmed what she had already sensed deep down. As the session adjourned for the day, Judge Brighton remained composed, but her expression revealed a growing curiosity about the case. The pieces were beginning to align, and while the answers weren't yet clear, a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, could feel the truth inching closer. Outside the courthouse, Emily and David walked to their car, Anastasia padding faithfully beside them. David's mind raced with thoughts of how to protect his daughter, while Emily looked down at Anastasia, silently thanking him for being her steadfast guardian. Together they knew the journey was far from over, but they also knew they had one another, and Anastasia, to face whatever came next. The day after, a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut adjourned, David found himself standing outside the weathered garden shed. Emily had gone to school, leaving him alone with his thoughts and Anastasia, who remained by his side. The dog had been acting restless again, sniffing at the edges of the shed as if urging David to open it. For days after the burglary, David had dismissed Anastasia's behavior, chalking it up to lingering nerves from that night. But now, after the revelations in court, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he had overlooked something critical. The wooden door creaked as David unlocked it, sunlight cutting through the dim interior. The shed smelled of damp earth and old wood, its shelves cluttered with gardening tools and supplies. Anastasia immediately stepped inside, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed around with an intensity David hadn't seen before. In the corner, Anastasia froze, his body stiff as he focused on a small pile of rags, partially hidden beneath a crate. David knelt down, his stomach tightening as he pulled the crate aside. Beneath it, he found a torn piece of cloth smeared with dirt. It looked like it had been hastily shoved there, its edges frayed as though it had been ripped from clothing. Beside it lay a rusted crowbar, its surface stained with faint streaks of dried mud. Anastasia's reaction was immediate and alarming. The dog growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the cloth as if it were something dangerous. His bark followed, sharp and commanding, echoing through the small space. David's pulse quickened. He realized this wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever Anastasia had sensed that night had led directly to this moment. Carefully, David bagged the cloth and the crowbar, his hands trembling slightly as he secured them in a plastic bag he found on one of the shelves. He knew these items needed to be turned over to the police. As he exited the shed, Anastasia stayed close, his growls subsiding, but his body still tense. David glanced down at him, silently thanking the dog for his instincts. At the police station, David handed over the items to the officer in charge of the case. The officer examined the bag briefly before assuring David that they would send the cloth for analysis. He mentioned that if there were any traces of DNA, it could potentially link the suspect to the crime scene. David nodded, his mind racing with what this discovery might mean for Emily and their case. Back in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, the next day, the prosecution introduced the new evidence. The torn cloth, they explained, had been found in the Radcliffe shed and was now being analyzed for forensic evidence. The crowbar, they suggested, could have been used to pry open the window during the break-in. Holcroft's lawyer immediately dismissed the discovery as circumstantial, arguing that there was no proof the items were connected to his client. Holcroft sat rigid, his expression a mixture of frustration and forced calm. Yet as the prosecution continued to present the evidence, cracks in his composure began to show. The sound grew louder as they drew closer, culminating in a sharp bark that echoed through the courtroom. Holcroft leaned back in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. His earlier smugness had entirely evaporated, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped expression. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Some attendees craned their necks to get a better view, while others exchanged whispers about what they had just witnessed. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Anastasia, as if trying to understand the dog's inexplicable reaction. The defense attorney scrambled to object, arguing that a dog's behavior couldn't be used as evidence. The judge raised her hand to quiet the room, reminding everyone that order must be maintained. However, the moment again had already left an indelible mark on the case. As Emily returned to her seat, she glanced at Holcroft, who now appeared visibly shaken. Anastasia settled at her side, his job done for the moment, but his presence continued to radiate an unspoken message. The courtroom atmosphere was electric, charged with the realization that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Outside, as the court adjourned for the day, David pulled Emily into a hug, his gratitude for Anastasia evident in the way he ruffled the dog's ears. Emily felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, it felt like justice wasn't just a distant dream. It was within reach, thanks to Anastasia and the people who believed in her. The journey wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. As the trial resumed the next morning, Judge Brighton appeared contemplative, her sharp eyes scanned in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, before she addressed the room. The events of the previous day had clearly left an impression on her, and her decision to investigate further added an unexpected turn to the trial. She announced that she wanted Anastasia's behavior examined by an expert to determine its relevance to the case. The courtroom stirred with curiosity. Emily clutched Anastasia's leash tightly, sensing the growing attention directed at her dog. David gave her a reassuring glance, though he too was unsure of what this new development might bring. The judge introduced Dr. Andrew Whitaker, a renowned animal behaviorist who had been called in to observe Anastasia. Dressed in a simple suit, Dr. Whitaker carried an air of quiet confidence. He approached Anastasia with calm, measured movements, careful not to startle the dog. Dr. Whitaker spent several minutes observing Anastasia's demeanor. He noted the dog's body language, his alert posture, his unwavering focus on certain individuals, and the subtle shifts in his ears and tail. Anastasia, though initially cautious, responded to the doctor's calm energy, allowing him to conduct his assessment. The judge asked Dr. Whitaker to explain his findings. He began by describing how dogs like Anastasia are capable of detecting minute changes in human behavior and physiology. He explained that Anastasia's reaction to Holcroft was not random, but likely triggered by a combination of familiar sense and the emotional signals he perceived. Dr. Whitaker elaborated on Anastasia's heightened ability to detect fear, anxiety, or guilt, emotions that often manifest subtly in body language, tone, or even scent. Dogs, he explained, are attuned to these changes, especially when they have been trained to protect and alert their owners to potential threats. He also touched on the possibility that Anastasia had recognized a scent on Holcroft that matched what he had detected the night of the burglary. This, combined with Anastasia's deep bond with Emily and his protective instincts, likely explained his aggressive reaction in court. The courtroom listened intently, the atmosphere charged with intrigue. Holcroft shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier composure faltering further under the weight of the expert's analysis. The prosecutor seized the opportunity to connect Dr. Whitaker's observations to the evidence already presented. Anastasia's behavior wasn't just a coincidence, it was a reflection of his training and instincts. The torn cloth, the crowbar, and now Anastasia's reaction were all pieces of a puzzle that painted a damning picture of Holcroft. Judge Brighton thanked Dr. Whitaker for his insights, her expression thoughtful. The courtroom reconvened the following day with an air of anticipation. The prosecutor began by presenting the results of the DNA analysis conducted on the torn cloth discovered in the garden shed. The lab results conclusively matched the DNA to Jack Holcroft, an announcement that sent a ripple of shock through the room. Holcroft, seated with his defense attorney, appeared pale. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by a tension that was impossible to ignore. The judge instructed a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, to remain silent as the prosecution continued. The prosecutor then revealed a second piece of damning evidence. Fingerprints on the crowbar, also found in the shed. Holcroft's prints were a perfect match. The crowbar, identified as the likely tool used to break into Emily's home, was now directly tied to him. At this revelation, Holcroft shifted uneasily in his seat. His attorney scrambled to object, claiming that the evidence could have been planted. However, the mounting weight of the evidence was becoming undeniable. David, sitting beside Emily and Anastasia, clenched his fists as he listened. He had always suspected Holcroft, but hearing the cold, hard facts solidified his resolve to see justice served. Emily, though nervous, felt a small sense of relief that the truth was finally surfacing. Anastasia, as if sensing the importance of the moment, sat upright, his eyes fixed on Holcroft. As the prosecution pressed forward, Holcroft's agitation grew. His hands trembled slightly, and beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. The prosecutor asked pointed questions about Holcroft's connection to the evidence, but his answers became increasingly defensive. In a sudden outburst, Holcroft accused David of framing him. He claimed that David had access to his tools and could have planted them in the shed to divert suspicion. The accusation hung in the air, drawing gasps from the spectators. David, calm but resolute, denied the claims. He explained that he had no reason to frame anyone, especially when his only focus was protecting his daughter and finding the person responsible for traumatizing her. The prosecutor pointed out that Holcroft's claims were not supported by any evidence, whereas the forensic findings clearly implicated him. Under the mounting pressure, Holcroft made a critical mistake. In a heated attempt to defend himself, he inadvertently revealed details about Emily's home that had not been disclosed publicly. He mentioned the placement of certain items in the living room and the type of lock on the back door, details only someone who had been inside the house would know. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The prosecutor seized the moment, highlighting that Holcroft's knowledge of these specifics could only mean one thing. He had been there on the night of the crime. Holcroft's face turned ashen as he realized his slip. His attorney tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Judge Brighton called for order. The silence in a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut lingered, heavy and oppressive, as all eyes turned to Jack Holcroft. His earlier bravado had crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and his pale complexion betrayed the turmoil within. The prosecutor's piercing gaze remained fixed on him, waiting for the inevitable crack in his defense. Holcroft clenched the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as he struggled to maintain his composure. His breathing grew uneven, and the tension in the room mounted. Finally, under the relentless scrutiny of a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut, and the damning revelations that surrounded him, he broke. His voice, unsteady and subdued, admitted to the burglary. He described how he had been desperate for money and had chosen Emily's home because it seemed like an easy target. He claimed he had scouted the house for days and believed it would be empty. He insisted he had no intention of harming anyone, and that his only goal was to steal valuables to pay off his mounting debts. The courtroom remained eerily quiet as his confession sank in. Emily sat frozen, her small hands clutching Anastasia's leash. David placed a protective arm around her shoulders, his heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. While Holcroft's admission brought the truth to light, it also confirmed the trauma Emily had endured. Holcroft's voice cracked as he explained how things had gone wrong. He hadn't anticipated Anastasia's presence. The dog's fierce protectiveness at the end startled him. The prosecutor turned to the judge, summarizing the case with an air of finality. Holcroft's confession, combined with the overwhelming evidence, left no room for doubt. The judge, maintaining her composure, nodded solemnly. The court's attention then shifted to Emily. The prosecutor commended her bravery in facing Holcroft in court and standing up for justice. Her actions, they said, were a testament to her strength and resilience, qualities that had helped unravel the truth. Judge Brighton addressed Emily directly, acknowledging the courage it had taken for her to recount the events of that night and confront her fears. She also praised Anastasia, noting his loyalty and instincts, which had played an instrumental role in uncovering the truth. Her words were measured and warm, offering reassurance to a young girl who had endured far too much. As the judge's gavel signaled the end of the trial, a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut erupted in applause. The sound was a mix of relief, admiration, and respect for Emily and Anastasia. As Holcroft stood to hear his sentencing, a courtroom in New Haven, Connecticut was silent once again. Judge Brighton delivered her ruling with clarity and firmness, emphasizing the gravity of his crimes. He was sentenced to a significant prison term for burglary and for endangering Emily's life. She pointed out that his actions not only violated the safety of their home, but also left a lasting impact on a young girl's sense of security. Holcroft hung his head, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a somber acceptance of his fate. Emily sat quietly beside her father, the weight of the past week slowly lifting. As the court session came to a close, she felt a mix of emotions, relief that the ordeal was over, and gratitude for the people who had supported her. David looked down at his daughter with immense pride. He saw a brave young girl who had faced something no child should ever have to endure and had come out stronger. His heart swelled as he glanced at Anastasia, who lay faithfully at Emily's feet. The dog had been a constant source of strength, his loyalty shining through every step of the way. Later that afternoon, Judge Brighton approached Emily and her family. She commended Emily's courage once more, expressing her admiration for how the young girl and her dog had played a pivotal role in securing justice. In a gesture of warmth and solidarity, she invited them to lunch at a local cafe. David hesitated at first, unsure of whether to accept such an unexpected offer, but Emily's eager expression convinced him otherwise. At the cafe, the atmosphere was lighthearted and warm. Judge Brighton spoke with Emily about her dreams and interests, taking the time to learn more about the young girl who had shown such remarkable bravery. Emily, initially shy, opened up as the conversation flowed. She talked about how Anastasia had been her best friend since she could remember, and how she wanted to help animals when she grew up. David shared stories about Emily and Anastasia's adventures, his voice tinged with pride and affection. Judge Brighton listened attentively, her admiration for the family growing. She spoke of her own experiences, drawing parallels to the challenges Emily had faced and how they had shaped her own path. By the end of the meal, an unspoken bond had formed between them. The invitation had been more than a simple gesture. It was a recognition of shared values and the strength of family. Judge Brighton promised to keep in touch, expressing her belief that Emily's courage and determination would inspire others for years to come. As they walked back to their car, Emily held Anastasia's leash tightly, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She looked up at her father, her smile reflecting the hope and strength she felt inside. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly safe. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Emily had learned the power of resilience, the importance of family, and the unbreakable bond she shared with Anastasia. Together, they had overcome the darkness, stepping into a brighter future filled with possibility. A week after the trial concluded, Emily and her father were settling back into their routine. The media coverage of the case had quieted down, allowing them some peace. One evening, David found a letter addressed to Emily in their mailbox. The envelope was plain, with no return address, sparking curiosity. Inside was a heartfelt note from an anonymous benefactor. The letter described how the donor had been deeply moved by Emily's bravery and resilience during the trial. They admired her courage in standing up to injustice, her bond with Anastasia, and her unwavering strength despite her young age. The note ended with an incredible gesture. The benefactor had set up a fund to cover Emily's future college education, ensuring she could pursue her dreams without financial burden. David read the letter aloud to Emily, his voice thick with emotion. Emily sat in stunned silence, her eyes wide with disbelief. The generosity of someone she had never met left her speechless. It was more than just financial support. It was a reminder that her story had touched lives far beyond their small town. Meanwhile, Anastasia's role in Emily's life began to evolve. Recognizing her potential to inspire others, David arranged for Anastasia to undergo special training to assist Emily with public speaking and presentations. Anastasia learned to remain calm during events, providing Emily with a sense of security as she shared her story. With Anastasia by her side, Emily found herself growing more confident, her voice steady as she spoke about her journey. The town of Ashford soon decided to honor Emily and Anastasia with a parade celebrating their courage and resilience. Banners lined the streets, and townspeople gathered to cheer as Emily rode through the main square on a decorated float. Anastasia sat proudly beside her, his tail wagging in delight. The mayor delivered a speech recognizing their bravery, and the community applauded their unwavering spirit. Amid the celebration, Emily felt a mix of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a newfound sense of belonging. The parade wasn't just about her, it was a testament to the power of unity and the strength that comes from supporting one another. The recognition didn't stop there. A renowned animal rights organization reached out to Emily and invited her and Anastasia to their annual gala. The organization wanted to highlight their story as an example of the incredible bond between humans and animals. At the gala, Emily stood on stage, her hand resting on Anastasia's head as she recounted their journey. The room erupted in applause, and Emily realized the impact their story had on others. Amid the whirlwind of events, Emily reconnected with an old friend, Sophia, who had moved away years earlier. Sophia reached out after hearing about the trial and the parade, offering Emily a shoulder to lean on during her newfound fame. Their friendship quickly rekindled, providing Emily with a sense of normalcy and support. As the days passed, Emily began to embrace her new reality. The generosity of strangers, the recognition from her community, and the support of those she loved reminded her that she was never alone. With Anastasia at her side, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. Their journey was far from over, but Emily and Anastasia had proven that courage and resilience could overcome even the darkest moments. Together, they had inspired a community and beyond, creating a legacy that would be remembered for years to come. As life slowly returned to normal, Emily began to notice how much her story had impacted others. Letters poured in from across the country, messages of support, admiration, and gratitude from people inspired by her courage. Among the letters was one from a publisher who wanted Emily to share her story in a book. The letter explained how her journey could inspire countless others who faced adversity. The publisher assured her that the process would be guided by a professional writer, ensuring her voice remained authentic. David read the proposal aloud, and Emily's heart swelled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The idea of sharing her experiences on such a large platform was daunting, but she also felt it was an opportunity to show others that bravery and resilience could shine through even the darkest moments. With her father's encouragement, Emily accepted the offer. Meetings with the publisher began immediately, and Emily found herself recounting her experiences in vivid detail. The writer assigned to her project was kind and patient, helping her navigate the emotions that surfaced as she revisited the events of the trial. Each chapter came to life, chronicling her bond with Anastasia, the trial, and the journey to justice. Writing the book became a therapeutic process for Emily. She found strength in her vulnerability, realizing that by opening up, she could help others find their own courage. The book also gave her a chance to reflect on how far she and Anastasia had come, their bond growing even stronger through every challenge they faced together. While working on the book, Emily decided she wanted to give back in a more hands-on way. She reached out to a local organization that trained service dogs, offering to volunteer. The trainers were thrilled to have her, especially with Anastasia by her side. Emily quickly immersed herself in the program, helping train dogs to assist children and adults with disabilities. One afternoon, while working with a golden retriever named Buddy, Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She watched as Buddy learned to fetch objects for his future owner, his tail wagging enthusiastically. Emily realized that just as Anastasia had changed her life, these dogs would go on to make a profound difference in the lives of others. It was a purpose that filled her days with joy and hope. Then one day a letter arrived in the mail. The return address was from the state penitentiary. Emily's heart sank as she opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. The letter was from Holcroft. In his letter, Holcroft expressed remorse for his actions. He admitted that his choices had been driven by desperation and poor judgment. But he also acknowledged the pain and fear he had caused Emily and her family. He wrote that hearing her speak during the trial had deeply affected him, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. Holcroft ended the letter by apologizing sincerely, stating that he hoped Emily could someday find it in her heart to forgive him. The letter left Emily feeling conflicted. She handed it to her father, who read it silently before placing it on the kitchen table. That evening, Emily and David sat together discussing the letter. Emily admitted that she didn't know how to feel. Part of her was still angry, remembering the fear she had felt that night and during the trial. But another part of her recognized the courage it took for Holcroft to write the letter. David gently reminded her that forgiveness didn't mean excusing what Holcroft had done. Instead, it was a way to free herself from the lingering anger and fear. He told her that forgiveness was a gift she could give herself, a step toward truly moving forward. After a long discussion, Emily decided to write back. In her letter, she thanked Holcroft for his apology and told him she hoped he would use his time in prison to make better choices. She wrote that while she might never forget what had happened, she was choosing to forgive him so she could focus on the future. Sending the letter felt like a weight had been lifted off Emily's shoulders. It wasn't just about Holcroft. It was about reclaiming her peace and ensuring that her past no longer held power over her. As the weeks passed, Emily's book neared completion. The publisher loved the manuscript, praising Emily for her honesty and strength. When the book was finally released, it became an instant hit. Readers from all walks of life resonated with her story, finding hope and inspiration in her words. The success of the book brought new opportunities for Emily. She was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and conferences, often accompanied by Anastasia. Together, they showed others the importance of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Through it all, Emily remained grounded. Her experiences had taught her the value of kindness, forgiveness, and the strength found in love and community. With her father's unwavering support and Anastasia by her side, Emily felt ready to embrace whatever the future held. The release of Emily's book opened doors she had never imagined. Its success extended beyond book signings and speaking engagements, capturing the attention of filmmakers. A renowned director reached out with a proposal to adapt Emily's story into a children's film. He explained that her journey could inspire not just adults, but also children who might be facing challenges of their own. After careful consideration and discussions with her father, Emily agreed. She wanted her story and Anastasia's heroism to resonate with families everywhere. The director assured her that the film would remain true to the spirit of her journey, portraying Anastasia as the steadfast companion who had helped her overcome fear and adversity. Production on the film began shortly after. Emily and her father were invited to visit the set, where they met the young actress portraying Emily. The girl was earnest and curious, asking Emily about her relationship with Anastasia and how they had faced those difficult moments together. Watching the story come to life felt surreal, but it also filled Emily with a sense of pride. She realized that sharing her experiences on such a large scale was a way of giving back. When the film was released, it was an instant success. Families flocked to theaters, captivated by the bond between Emily and Anastasia. The film didn't shy away from the struggles Emily had faced, but it emphasized the courage, love, and resilience that had ultimately triumphed. Parents thanked her for showing their children that bravery could take many forms, and children wrote letters to Emily, inspired by her story and dreaming of their own special connection with an animal like Anastasia. Amid the film's success, Emily found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since the night of the burglary. Anastasia had been her rock through it all, his unwavering loyalty and instinct pulling her through moments when she felt she couldn't go on. She remembered how he had stood protectively by her side during the trial, his presence giving her strength to speak the truth. Anastasia wasn't just a service dog, he was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. Emily often thought about how different her life might have been without him. He had taught her about trust, about perseverance, and about the unique bond that could exist between a person and their dog. As her story continued to inspire others, Emily was invited to give one final speech at a large charity event benefiting organizations that train service animals.